Hello, and welcome to this month's lesson, all about risk management through Chapter Standards Board. The other part of this lesson is all about values and finding shared meaning. But in this installment, we are going to talk about Chapter Standards Board and what the purpose of the Chapter Standards Board is, what it should look like at every chapter, and things like that. So, the Chapter Standards Board is the judicial body, if you will, of each collegiate chapter of Omega Phi Alpha. And so the CSB serves a few different purposes. One is to approve membership status requests on a local level. So there are some times that statuses can be approved on the local level, and the CSB is responsible for that. Another item that the CSB does is review reports of policy violations that come into the chapter. And we'll talk a little bit more about this and when they refer to the National Standards Board. And additionally, the CSB enforces chapter policies and chapter procedures, which may be different from national policies and procedures, or there may be additional ones that are not applicable on the national level. Also, for some chapters that charge fines, the CSB is responsible for charging those fines and ensuring that they are collected. The CSB also acts as a mediator between members and any issues or conflict that arises in the chapter, such as like interpersonal conflict or concerns about events or anything that happens. The CSB would be the body that works to mediate those conflicts. So the CSB in those instances does offer solutions to any conflict, and they're responsible for ensuring that all members uphold the national, local, and university standards. So let's talk a little bit about who the CSB is. So the CSB is led by the chapter vice president, and this officer presides over all meetings of the CSB. They have to keep accurate meeting records, and then they have to keep accurate records of results of the meetings, which includes member status changes. So if you do have members who request on a local level to have an LOA semester, or maybe they're in the semester of their graduation and they want to go alum, they would notify the CSB, and then the vice president would need to update all of these statuses by the posted deadline in OPA portal. The CSB and the VP also keep track of the local constitution. They make sure it's up to date with the national constitution, that it doesn't conflict with the national constitution, and really that it's a timeless document. And when I say constitution, I mean constitution and bylaws. And then any other meetings of the CSB, there needs to be great records and minutes kept from that. So if there are any disassociation meetings, we need to make sure we're keeping all the records from that. The total number of members on the CSB is determined by the vice president or maybe the Constitution prior to the election at the start of each semester. And typically, we do recommend that there is an odd number of members on the CSB. So something that we've been noticing with chapters is that there seems to be a little bit of confusion about the CSB. So what the CSB does, which I just explained to you, and who the CSB is. So in thinking of that, we want to consider chapter by chapter. Some chapters have processes that work for them, and we are not here to tell you that you have to change something or that's working and that all of our chapters have to do exactly the same thing. We do really value chapters' individual autonomy, and we want to respect that. At the same time, we really want to make sure that CSB member selection, that there's a standard process for it and that it's fair and equitable from chapter to chapter. So I would say that the standard practice for a CSB is that members who are on the CSB are elected by the entire chapter. So the president of the chapter should never serve on the CSB. There may be an exception to this rule if you have a really small chapter that you're working on rebuilding and you don't have very many people, then it may be necessary. But that is probably the only exception to that rule. So the president of the chapter should never serve on the CSB. And there could be two other elected executive board members that can be elected to the CSB. Maybe like the sisterhood or the service director or the membership director. And some chapters do have in their constitution that certain executive board positions are automatically members of the CSB. And I think that is fine because those executive board officers are being elected into their role. So the chapter has elected them into something. So I would say that is fine. But there should be at least 3 elected members of the CSB who are not members of the chapter executive board. So any member who is considering entering the role as a member of CSB has to be in good standing, so they cannot owe any fines or be late on dues or be in violation of a policy or being investigated for a policy violation. None of that in order to serve. And then again, the chapter should form a process for selecting members. So one option could be that you have an application, maybe the same application they use for officers, and it has to be submitted to the vice president by a certain deadline. And then the vice president will present the applications or nominations at a chapter meeting, and an election will be held. And you'll need to follow your chapter constitution and bylaws for what the minimum vote, like what your quorum is for an election. And then another way could just be that people can self-nominate or someone can nominate them to serve on the CSB, and then you do an election from there. I do just want to briefly talk about that CSB meetings need to be confidential. We are noticing, I'm not sure if it's a result of living in a virtual world for so long or what it is, but we are noticing that some information that is hashed out in a CSB meeting is being shared outside of the CSB. So we just want to emphasize that CSB meetings are confidential and that we would recommend that all CSB members sign a confidentiality statement, and that your chapter has a procedure for what happens if a CSB member happens to break that confidentiality. So again, just to recap here, in this monthly lesson where we're talking about shared values and shared meaning, and we're also wanting to touch on risk management, and part of that risk management from a chapter level is the chapter standards board and ensuring that every single chapter has a CSB that is operating efficiently and appropriately. So again, there are some common issues that come before the CSB: status changes, failure to meet requirements, maybe officers not fulfilling duties, local dues waivers. Some chapters have those come before the CSB and others have those go before the executive board, either way. And then any conflicts that are happening within the chapter. So we want to make sure, again, I can't emphasize this enough, that the CSB is filled with people that are chosen in a fair and equitable way, and that we do not have too many people from a chapter executive board serving on the CSB. And with that, we also want to make sure that every executive board member is not attending every chapter standards board meeting. Sometimes members may be going to chapter standards because they have concerns with leadership of the chapter, and it's really important that we create a safe place for them to express those concerns, which may be in the CSB. So I would strongly encourage you all to allow the vice president to oversee the CSB and not have any other officers who are not on the CSB regularly attending meetings. And if at any time you have questions about, how should my CSB do this, you can always reach out to your chapter health specialist or the chapter health manager, but you can also reach out to the National Standards Board director. You can just email nsb@omegaphi.org. And I also wanted to say, if you all receive policy violations on a local level, it's important to really evaluate those. And if you think it's a serious concern and is a valid report, that has evidence that backs it up, you should forward that to the National Standards Board, which is the sororities governing body that determines what happens when policies are violated. And finally, another thing for risk management that our chapters and our chapter leaders can do is to review all of the policies and procedures of our organization. And all of those are posted on OPA portal. If you go to files shared by national staff and scroll down to national operations, you will find all the policies and all the procedures in there. And as executive board officers, it is your responsibility to understand what Omega Phi Alpha's policies and procedures are, and that you are upholding all of those standards and being a model for all of your members to do the same. So if you have any questions about risk management or chapter standards or policies and procedures, again, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help, and we so appreciate all the work that you all are doing leading your chapters.